Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The Enigma of the Silent Elevator, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Good evening, mystery lovers. Stephen here, your host for Cozy Mysteries, and tonight I have a tale that would challenge even the most astute detective's powers of observation. Picture, if you will, the Grand Metropolitan Hotel in the heart of London's theatre district, a bastion of luxury where the wealthy and influential sought refuge from the common world. It was here, on a fog-laden evening in November, that the most extraordinary circumstances would unfold. Chapter 1. A most peculiar predicament. Our Belgian friend had been invited to the Grand Metropolitan by Lord Pemberton, a distinguished member of Parliament who had developed a peculiar fascination with criminal psychology. The invitation was ostensibly social, a quiet dinner to discuss the finer points of detection over fine wine. However, fate, as it so often does, had other plans entirely. The Grand Metropolitan boasted the latest in modern conveniences, including 2 magnificent elevators that glided silently between its 7 floors. These mechanical marvels, fitted with polished brass and mahogany panels, had been the pride of the establishment since their installation the previous year. Little did anyone suspect that one of these symbols of progress would become a chamber of death. The evening began pleasantly enough. The hotel's grand lobby buzzed with the usual collection of guests, theatre patrons in evening dress, businessmen clutching their leather cases, and the occasional exotic tourist drawn by London's reputation. The elevator operators, resplendent in their burgundy uniforms with gold braiding, maintained their posts with military precision, ferrying guests between floors with practiced efficiency. At precisely 8:45, Mrs. Victoria Ashford, a widow of considerable means and even greater social ambition, stepped into the left elevator on the ground floor. She was bound, she informed the operator, for the 5th floor, where she maintained a suite overlooking Hyde Park. Mrs. Ashford was known throughout London society for her elaborate dinner parties, and her particular talent for collecting both gossip and influential acquaintances. The operator, a young man named Thomas Fletcher, who had worked at the hotel for 3 years without incident, closed the brass gate with its characteristic soft clang. Several guests in the lobby later testified to hearing the familiar whir of the elevator's machinery as it began its ascent. This was the last time anyone would see Victoria Ashford alive. What occurred next defied all logic and reason. The elevator, instead of proceeding smoothly to its destination, came to an abrupt halt between the 2nd and 3rd floors. This was not entirely unusual. Mechanical difficulties occasionally plagued even the finest equipment. Fletcher immediately began the standard procedure for such situations, attempting to restart the motor while calling down to the maintenance staff. When 15 minutes passed without resolution, the hotel manager, Mr. Harold Pembroke, ordered the elevator to be manually lowered to the ground floor. The brass gate was opened with the usual flourish, but what greeted the assembled crowd was a sight that would haunt the Grand Metropolitan's reputation for years to come. Mrs. Victoria Ashford lay crumpled in the corner of the elevator, her elaborate evening gown spread around her like dark wings. There was no question of her condition. Death had clearly claimed her, though no obvious wound was visible. More puzzling still, she was entirely alone in the compartment, despite Fletcher's insistence that no one else had entered the elevator with her. The hotel's physician, Dr. Weatherby, was summoned immediately. His preliminary examination revealed something that sent whispers of unease through the gathering crowd. Mrs. Ashford bore the unmistakable signs of strangulation, though no murder weapon was apparent. Furthermore, her reticule had been disturbed, its contents scattered across the elevator floor. By this time word had reached our observant Belgian friend, who had been enjoying pre-dinner conversation in Lord Pemberton's suite on the 6th floor. The distinctive sound of police whistles and the general commotion below had drawn his attention to the lobby. With Lord Pemberton at his side, he descended to investigate the disturbance that had so dramatically interrupted the hotel's evening routine. Inspector Morrison of Scotland Yard arrived within the hour, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had seen too many inexplicable crimes. He immediately ordered the elevator sealed and began the tedious process of interviewing witnesses. However, the testimonies only deepened the mystery rather than illuminating it. The lobby had been populated throughout the evening, yet no guest recalled seeing anyone else enter the elevator with Mrs. Ashford. The operator, Fletcher, remained adamant that he had transported only one passenger. The elevator had made no stops between the ground floor and its mysterious halt between the second and third floors. As Inspector Morrison scratched his head in bewilderment, our Belgian detective stood quietly in the corner of the lobby, his green eyes already taking in details that others had overlooked. The scene before him presented a puzzle that would test every method he had developed throughout his distinguished career. The Grand Metropolitan's reputation hung in the balance, its guests whispered nervously among themselves, and somewhere in the hotel's elegant corridors a killer walked free, confident that the perfect crime had been committed in broad sight of dozens of witnesses, yet seen by none. Chapter 2. Traces in the Brass. The following morning brought no relief from the previous evening's bewilderment. Our meticulous detective had spent a restless night, his orderly mind grappling with the apparent impossibility of the crime. By dawn, he had already established a mental framework for the investigation, though the pieces of this particular puzzle seemed determined to resist conventional arrangement. Inspector Morrison had returned to the Grand Metropolitan at precisely 9 hours, armed with the preliminary findings from the coroner's examination. Mrs. Ashford had indeed died from strangulation, accomplished by someone with considerable strength. The curious aspect, however, was the absence of defensive wounds or signs of struggle. It appeared the victim had been taken entirely by surprise. The elevator itself had become the focus of intense scrutiny. Our Belgian friend, with his characteristic attention to detail, had requested permission to examine the scene personally. Inspector Morrison, though initially reluctant to allow civilian interference, had learned to respect the little detective's methods through previous encounters. The elevator's interior told a story that conventional observation might have missed entirely. The polished brass handrail bore several distinct sets of fingerprints, which was hardly unusual given the number of passengers who used the facility daily. However, one set stood out with particular clarity, prints that appeared to have been made by hands gripping the rail with unusual force. More intriguing still was a small tear in the elevator's mahogany panelling, positioned at approximately shoulder height for an average-sized person. The wood showed signs of recent damage, as if something had been pressed against it with considerable pressure. Adjacent to this mark, caught between two panels, was a fragment of dark blue fabric that matched neither Mrs. Ashford's burgundy evening gown nor the operator's uniform. The floor of the elevator revealed additional mysteries. Despite the hotel's meticulous cleaning standards, several small particles of an unusual substance caught our detective's keen eye. The particles appeared to be a mixture of sawdust and metal filings, suggesting recent construction or mechanical work. This was particularly curious, given that the elevator had supposedly been in perfect working order. Thomas Fletcher, the elevator operator, proved to be a young man of nervous disposition but apparent honesty. During his second interview with Inspector Morrison, he maintained his original account with unwavering consistency. He had operated the elevator for Mrs. Ashford alone, closed the gate securely, and begun the ascent to the 5th floor when the mechanical failure occurred. He had followed standard procedures exactly. However, our Belgian friend's questioning revealed additional details that had escaped the inspector's attention. Fletcher admitted that just before the elevator stopped, he had heard what sounded like a muffled conversation from within the passenger compartment. When pressed for specifics, he could only say that it sounded like Mrs. Ashford speaking to someone, though he had been certain she was alone. The hotel's records provided another piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Ashford had been staying at the Grand Metropolitan for 5 days, occupying the Windsor suite on the 5th floor. Her behaviour during this period had been typical of her London visits: lengthy shopping expeditions, afternoon tea with various society ladies, and elaborate preparations for the evening's social engagements. Dr. Weatherby's more detailed examination revealed that Mrs. Ashford had dined heartily approximately 2 hours before her death. Her stomach contained the remains of roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, and a considerable quantity of wine. This timeline corresponded with the hotel's dinner service, though no one recalled seeing her in the dining room that evening. The guest register for the previous day showed several new arrivals, any of whom might have had opportunity to encounter Mrs. Ashford. Among these was Mr. Geoffrey Hamilton, a theatrical producer who had checked in that morning, claiming to be scouting locations for a new production. There was also Miss Eleanor Fairfax, a young woman who identified herself as a journalist, researching an article about luxury hotels. Perhaps most interesting was the arrival of Colonel Reginald Blackwood, a military gentleman who had served in India for 30 years before returning to England. The colonel had specifically requested a room on the 3rd floor, directly above where the elevator had mysteriously stopped. When questioned, he claimed to have been unpacking his luggage at the time of the incident and had heard nothing unusual. The forensic examination of Mrs. Ashford's belongings revealed that her reticule had indeed been searched, though curiously nothing appeared to be missing. Her jewellery remained intact, her money was untouched, and even her collection of personal letters seemed complete. This suggested that robbery had not been the motive, eliminating the most obvious explanation for the crime. As our Belgian detective compiled these observations, a pattern began to emerge, though its meaning remained frustratingly elusive. The killer had demonstrated both careful planning and intimate knowledge of the hotel's operations. The crime had been committed in the most public possible location, yet had somehow remained invisible to dozens of potential witnesses. The hotel staff had been questioned extensively, but their testimonies only reinforced the impossibility of the situation. The elevator's mechanical failure appeared to be genuine, though its timing seemed suspiciously convenient for the murderer's purposes. By afternoon, Inspector Morrison was growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of conventional clues. However, our meticulous Belgian friend had begun to discern the faint outline of a solution, though he wisely kept his theories to himself until more evidence could be gathered. Chapter 3. The Handkerchief's Tale. The 3rd day of investigation brought an unexpected development that would prove crucial to unravelling the mystery. A chambermaid, while cleaning the 2nd floor corridor, discovered a gentleman's handkerchief wedged between the elevator doors at precisely the height where the car had stopped during the fatal incident. This seemingly insignificant item would provide our Belgian detective with his first concrete clue. The handkerchief itself was of exceptional quality, Irish linen with hand-rolled edges and an embroidered monogram reading RB in elegant script. More significantly, it bore traces of a distinctive cologne and several small stains that would require careful analysis. The positioning of the handkerchief suggested it had been caught during the elevator's malfunction, trapped as the doors attempted to close. Inspector Morrison immediately connected the initials to Colonel Reginald Blackwood, the recently arrived guest occupying a 3rd-floor room. When confronted with this evidence, the colonel's demeanour shifted noticeably. His previous calm composure gave way to visible agitation, though he continued to maintain his innocence of any wrongdoing. "I have no idea how my handkerchief came to be in such a location," the colonel insisted, his military bearing somewhat diminished by the circumstances. "I keep my personal effects in proper order, and I certainly would have noticed if a handkerchief had gone missing." Our Belgian friend, observing this interview from the corner of the room, noted several telling details. The colonel's hands bore small scratches that appeared recent, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of hasty grooming. Most curious of all was his repeated glancing toward the elevator, as if the mechanical contraption held some particular significance for him. The hotel's laundry records provided additional insight into the colonel's recent activities. His account showed an unusual request for expedited cleaning service on the morning following Mrs. Ashford's death. Several items of clothing, including 2 shirts and a jacket, had been processed with unusual urgency. When examined, these garments showed signs of hasty washing, particularly around the collar and cuffs. Meanwhile, the forensic examination of the handkerchief revealed traces of face powder that matched the cosmetics found in Mrs. Ashford's reticule. This physical connection between the victim and the colonel could hardly be dismissed as coincidental. However, the manner in which this evidence had come to light troubled our meticulous detective considerably. Dr. Weatherby's analysis of the mysterious particles found in the elevator provided another piece of the puzzle. The sawdust and metal filings were consistent with recent mechanical work, specifically the type of modifications that might be made to elevator machinery. The hotel's maintenance records, however, showed no scheduled work on either elevator during the period in question. The hotel manager, Mr. Pembroke, when pressed about unauthorized maintenance, reluctantly admitted that several guests had complained about unusual noises from the elevator shaft during the previous week. These complaints had been logged but not immediately investigated due to the apparent normality of the elevator's operation. This delay would prove to have tragic consequences. Thomas Fletcher, the elevator operator, provided additional details under renewed questioning. He recalled that Colonel Blackwood had been particularly interested in the elevator's operation during his first day at the hotel, asking detailed questions about the mechanical systems and safety procedures. Such curiosity might have seemed innocent from a gentleman with engineering interests, but in light of recent events it took on a more sinister significance. The investigation of Mrs. Ashford's social connections revealed a complex web of relationships that extended far beyond London society. Among her correspondences were several letters from India, including at least 2 from military officers who had served alongside Colonel Blackwood. These letters suggested that Mrs. Ashford had been involved in some form of business dealings related to colonial investments. One letter, in particular, caught our detective's attention. Written by a Captain Morrison, no relation to the inspector, it referenced certain irregularities in regimental funds that had occurred 30 years prior. The letter implied that Mrs. Ashford possessed information that could be damaging to several retired officers, including those who had since returned to England. This correspondence suggested a possible motive for murder, though the precise nature of Mrs. Ashford's knowledge remained unclear. However, it established that she had been engaged in what might charitably be called information brokerage, using her social position to gather and leverage sensitive details about prominent individuals. The Colonel's military records, obtained through official channels, revealed a distinguished career that had ended somewhat abruptly 5 years earlier. While the official reason given was medical retirement due to tropical fever, there were suggestions of financial irregularities that had never been formally investigated. These whispers of impropriety might well have provided Mrs. Ashford with leverage over the Colonel. As our Belgian friend pieced together these various elements, a clearer picture began to emerge. Mrs. Ashford had apparently been blackmailing Colonel Blackwood, threatening to expose some scandal from his military service. The Colonel, facing financial ruin and social disgrace, had devised an ingenious method of silencing his tormentor while creating an apparently impossible crime. However, several aspects of this theory troubled our meticulous detective. The physical evidence, while compelling, seemed almost too convenient in its placement. The handkerchief's discovery, in particular, struck him as suspiciously timed. A criminal clever enough to devise such an elaborate murder scheme would hardly be careless enough to leave such obvious evidence. Moreover, the Colonel's behaviour during questioning suggested a man more confused than guilty. His agitation appeared genuine rather than calculated, and his inability to explain the evidence against him seemed more like honest bewilderment than careful deception. Chapter 4. Mechanical Deceptions. The 4th day of investigation brought a revelation that would fundamentally alter the direction of the case. Our Belgian detective, dissatisfied with the conventional interpretation of events, had requested a thorough examination of the elevator's mechanical systems. What this inspection revealed challenged every assumption that had been made about the murder method. The elevator's machinery showed signs of deliberate tampering, but not in the manner anyone had expected. Rather than being sabotaged to create a malfunction, certain components had been modified to allow for precise control of the elevator's movement. Hidden within the motor housing was a secondary mechanism that would permit someone with knowledge of its operation to stop and start the elevator at predetermined positions. This discovery transformed the investigation entirely. The mechanical failure that had trapped Mrs. Ashford between floors had been no failure at all, but a deliberately orchestrated event. Someone with extensive technical knowledge had prepared the elevator as an instrument of murder, creating what appeared to be an impossible crime scene. The modifications were the work of a skilled engineer, executed with precision and concealed with remarkable ingenuity. Most hotel staff, even those responsible for maintenance, would never have detected the alterations during routine inspections. The killer had clearly spent considerable time planning this aspect of the crime, suggesting a level of premeditation that went far beyond a crime of passion. Mr. Geoffrey Hamilton, the theatrical producer who had arrived the day before the murder, suddenly became a person of intense interest. Further investigation revealed that his background included not only theatrical work, but also a degree in mechanical engineering from Cambridge University. His request for a room overlooking the elevator shaft now seemed considerably less innocent. When questioned again, Hamilton maintained his story about scouting hotel locations for a theatrical production. However, his knowledge of the hotel's mechanical systems proved remarkably detailed for someone supposedly seeing the building for the first time. He could describe the elevator's specifications with startling accuracy, suggesting previous familiarity with the equipment. The hotel's employment records revealed that Hamilton had worked briefly as a consulting engineer during the elevator's installation the previous year. This connection had not been mentioned during his initial interview, an omission that now appeared deliberately deceptive. His presence at the hotel at the time of the murder could no longer be dismissed as mere coincidence. Colonel Blackwood, meanwhile, remained under suspicion due to the handkerchief evidence, but his lack of technical expertise made it unlikely that he could have executed the mechanical modifications alone. If he were involved in the murder, he would have required an accomplice with considerable engineering knowledge. The relationship between Hamilton and the colonel became the subject of intense investigation. Hotel staff confirmed that the two men had been seen in conversation on several occasions, though both had initially denied knowing each other. This deception suggested a conspiracy, with each man contributing specific skills to the murder plot. Mrs. Ashford's appointment book, discovered in her suite, revealed that she had scheduled a meeting for the evening of her death. The appointment was noted cryptically as R.B. Final Terms, which could easily refer to Colonel Blackwood. If this interpretation were correct, Mrs. Ashford had been expecting to meet the colonel on the night she died, possibly for a blackmail payment. The forensic examination of the elevator's control mechanism revealed fingerprints that matched those found on the brass handrail. However, these prints belonged neither to Colonel Blackwood nor to Geoffrey Hamilton. This unexpected development suggested the involvement of a third party, further complicating an already complex investigation. Thomas Fletcher, the elevator operator, came under renewed scrutiny when it was discovered that his younger brother worked as an apprentice machinist at a local engineering firm. This family connection provided another possible source of technical expertise, though Fletcher's nervous demeanour seemed more consistent with an unwilling participant than a calculated murderer. The young operator admitted, under pressure, that he had noticed unusual sounds from the elevator machinery during the previous week, but had been instructed by someone, he claimed not to remember who, not to report these observations to the maintenance staff. This instruction had come with a substantial monetary incentive, which Fletcher had accepted without questioning its source. Our Belgian detective found Fletcher's story partially credible but incomplete. The young man was clearly withholding information, though whether from fear or complicity remained unclear. His position as elevator operator made him crucial to any murder plot involving the mechanical systems, yet his obvious terror suggested he had not fully understood his role in the scheme. The modifications to the elevator had required not only technical skill, but also access to the machinery during off hours. Hotel security records showed several instances of unauthorized access to the basement mechanical rooms during the week preceding the murder. The identity of these intruders remained unknown, as the hotel's night watchman had been conveniently absent due to illness during several key periods. The investigation had revealed a complex conspiracy involving multiple participants, each contributing specific elements to an elaborate murder scheme. However, the precise relationships between these individuals and their respective roles in the crime remained frustratingly unclear. As our meticulous detective compiled these findings, he began to perceive the outline of a solution. The murder had been planned with extraordinary care and executed with technical precision, yet the conspirators had made several crucial errors that would ultimately lead to their exposure. The handkerchief evidence, which had initially seemed to implicate Colonel Blackwood directly, now appeared to be a deliberately planted clue designed to mislead the investigation. The real murderer had anticipated the need for a scapegoat and had carefully prepared evidence to support false conclusions. Chapter 5. The Society Web. The investigation took an unexpected turn when our Belgian detective decided to explore Mrs. Ashford's social connections more thoroughly. What he discovered was an intricate web of relationships, financial dependencies, and long-buried secrets that stretched across London's most prestigious social circles and reached back to the colonial territories of the empire. Mrs. Ashford's correspondence, upon closer examination, revealed her to be far more than a simple society hostess. She had been conducting what could only be described as a sophisticated information-gathering operation, using her social position to collect compromising details about prominent figures in politics, military service, and business. Her afternoon tea parties and dinner engagements served as cover for a lucrative blackmail enterprise. The scope of her activities was staggering. Among her papers were found detailed dossiers on more than 30 individuals, including several members of Parliament, high-ranking military officers and wealthy industrialists. Each file contained carefully documented evidence of financial irregularities, personal scandals, or professional misconduct that could destroy careers and reputations if made public. Colonel Blackwood was indeed among her targets, but he was far from the only one. His file contained evidence of embezzlement during his service in India, involving the misappropriation of funds intended for native regiment supplies. The amount in question was substantial, enough to warrant criminal prosecution. Exposure would have meant not only prison but complete social destruction. However, the colonel's case was complicated by the involvement of other officers who had participated in, or concealed, the embezzlement. Mrs. Ashford had been demanding payments, not just from Blackwood, but from several of his former colleagues, creating a network of victims who all had compelling motives for murder. Geoffrey Hamilton's connection to this network proved more complex than initially apparent. His theatrical work had brought him into contact with several of Mrs. Ashford's targets, including a cabinet minister, whose gambling debts had been covered up through Hamilton's assistance. The producer had been recruited not as a co-conspirator in blackmail, but as an agent in the murder plot designed to eliminate their mutual tormentor. The modifications to the elevator had been planned months in advance, with Hamilton using his legitimate engineering consulting work as cover for his reconnaissance of the hotel's systems. His expertise had been crucial not only in creating the mechanical trap, but also in timing its deployment to coincide with Mrs. Ashford's predictable evening routine. The third participant in the conspiracy was revealed through a careful analysis of the hotel staff schedules. James Morrison, the night watchman who had been conveniently ill during the crucial preparation period, was discovered to be the brother-in-law of one of Mrs. Ashford's blackmail victims. His absence had allowed the conspirators access to the elevator machinery without detection. Morrison's illness had been fabricated to provide an alibi while giving the conspirators freedom to install their modifications. His family connection to the broader network of Mrs. Ashford's victims explained his willingness to participate in the murder, although his role had been limited to providing access rather than direct participation in the killing. The financial records of Mrs. Ashford's victims revealed the substantial sums she had been extracting from her targets. Colonel Blackwood alone had paid over $5,000 during the past year, money he could ill afford on his military pension. Similar payments had been documented from other victims, creating a collective motive for eliminating their tormentor. The murder itself had been planned to appear impossible precisely because it seemed to lack any viable suspect. By creating a locked room mystery, the conspirators had hoped to deflect suspicion from themselves while eliminating the threat Mrs. Ashford represented. The complexity of the scheme reflected both their desperation and their collective resources. However, the execution of the murder had required careful coordination between multiple participants, and this complexity had created opportunities for error. The handkerchief evidence, intended to implicate an innocent party, had been placed too obviously. The mechanical modifications, while ingenious, had left traces that forensic examination could reveal. Most cruelly, the conspirators had underestimated the investigative capabilities that would be brought to bear on their seemingly perfect crime. They had planned for conventional police methods, but had not anticipated the involvement of a detective with our Belgian friend's particular talents for unravelling complex deceptions. The victim's appointment book revealed that she had been expecting not one, but several visitors on the night of her death. The notation RB final terms had been followed by additional entries, suggesting meetings with other individuals. This evidence indicated that Mrs. Ashford had been planning a final confrontation with multiple blackmail victims simultaneously. The conspirators had learned of this plan through their collective intelligence gathering, and had realized that the meeting represented their best opportunity to eliminate Mrs. Ashford while maintaining plausible alibis. The elevator trap had been activated during what should have been Mrs. Ashford's journey to her suite after completing her evening's business. Our meticulous detective began to piece together the sequence of events that had led to the murder. The complexity of the conspiracy, while initially confusing, now provided him with multiple avenues of investigation and numerous opportunities to expose the conspirators' deception. Chapter 6. Alibis and deceptions. The sixth day of investigation brought our Belgian detective face to face with the challenge of untangling a web of carefully constructed alibis and deliberate deceptions. Each suspect had prepared their story with meticulous attention to detail, yet it was precisely this over-preparation that would ultimately betray them. Colonel Blackwood's alibi seemed unshakable at first examination. He claimed to have been in his third-floor room during the entire evening, unpacking his belongings and writing letters to former colleagues. Hotel staff confirmed seeing him in the corridor at various times, and several guests reported hearing him moving about in his room. However, closer investigation revealed subtle inconsistencies in these testimonies. The timing of the colonel's appearances in the corridor followed a suspiciously regular pattern, as if he had been deliberately creating witnesses to his presence at specific intervals. More significantly, the letters he claimed to have been writing were dated 2 days after the murder, suggesting they had been composed after the fact to support his alibi. Geoffrey Hamilton's alibi was equally elaborate. He maintained that he had been in the hotel's restaurant during the crucial period, dining alone while making notes about the establishment's theatrical potential. The restaurant staff recalled serving him, and his table reservation was properly documented. However, the details of his meal, when compared with the restaurant's menu and serving times, revealed several impossible elements. The producer had ordered dishes that were not available on the evening in question, and had supposedly consumed a 3-course meal in a time frame that would have been physically impossible. More damaging still, his notebook contained detailed observations about parts of the hotel he could not have seen from the restaurant, suggesting he had been moving about the building during the time he claimed to be dining. James Morrison, the night watchman whose convenient illness had facilitated access to the elevator machinery, proved to be the weakest link in the conspiracy. His medical excuse was supported by a doctor's certificate, but the physician in question had a reputation for providing false documentation in exchange for payment. When pressed, the doctor admitted that Morrison had never actually been examined or treated. The watchman's absence from duty had been planned months in advance, coordinated with the other conspirators' schedules to provide the necessary window for installing the elevator modifications. His family connection to one of Mrs. Ashford's other blackmail victims had made him a natural recruit for the murder plot, though his lack of criminal experience had made him the most vulnerable member of the conspiracy. Thomas Fletcher, the elevator operator, remained a puzzle. His obvious terror and confused responses suggested he had been manipulated rather than being a willing participant. However, his position had been crucial to the murder plan's success, and his brother's mechanical expertise had provided necessary technical knowledge. Under renewed questioning, Fletcher revealed that he had been approached several weeks before the murder by a gentleman who claimed to represent a group interested in testing the hotel's security procedures. He had been paid to follow specific instructions regarding the elevator's operation and to avoid reporting certain irregularities to his supervisors. The young operator had believed he was participating in a legitimate security audit, never suspecting that his cooperation was being used to facilitate murder. His realization of the truth had come only after Mrs. Ashford's body was discovered, explaining his subsequent terror and confusion during police questioning. The investigation of the hotel's guest registration revealed additional deceptions. Geoffrey Hamilton had checked in under his own name, but had provided false information about his theatrical company and business purposes. His room reservation had been made not through normal channels, but through a third party who had paid in advance with untraceable cash. Colonel Blackwood's registration showed similar irregularities. While his military credentials were genuine, his stated reason for visiting London was false. He had claimed to be settling estate matters for a deceased relative, but investigation revealed no such relative or estate. His true purpose in London had been to coordinate the murder plot with his co-conspirators. The financial investigation revealed how the conspiracy had been funded. Mrs. Ashford's blackmail payments had been pooled by her victims to finance the elaborate murder scheme. The mechanical modifications, bribery of hotel staff, and various expenses associated with creating false alibis had required substantial resources, but the combined contributions of multiple victims had made the plan financially feasible. The discovery of a hidden meeting location provided crucial evidence of the conspiracy's coordination. A rented office in Bloomsbury had served as headquarters for planning the murder, with lease payments traceable to accounts controlled by Mrs. Ashford's victims. Documents found at this location detailed the elevator modification plans and timing schedules for the murder. Most damaging of all was the discovery of practice sessions conducted at a similar hotel, where the conspirators had tested their elevator modification techniques. Records showed that several of the suspects had stayed at this establishment during recent weeks, ostensibly for unrelated business, but actually to perfect their murder method. Our Belgian detective now possessed sufficient evidence to expose the conspiracy, but he recognized that proving the case in court would require careful presentation of the complex evidence. The multiple participants and elaborate planning would make the trial a challenging affair, requiring clear demonstration of each individual's role in the collective crime. The psychological pressure of the investigation was beginning to tell on the conspirators. Hamilton had become increasingly agitated during questioning, while Colonel Blackwood's military composure was showing signs of strain. Morrison had effectively disappeared, having fled his lodgings when he realized the investigation was closing in on the conspiracy. The hotel management, meanwhile, was growing increasingly concerned about the damage to their reputation. The Grand Metropolitan's prestige had been built on discretion and security, qualities that seemed sadly lacking in light of recent events. Pressure was mounting for a swift resolution to the case, adding urgency to our detectives' work. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. The seventh day of investigation marked a turning point in the case, as our Belgian detective prepared to spring the trap he had been carefully constructing around the conspirators. The evidence was now sufficient to expose their guilt, but he chose to employ his characteristic method of gathering all suspects together for a dramatic revelation of the truth. Inspector Morrison, though initially skeptical of this theatrical approach, had learned to trust our detective's methods. The inspector agreed to arrange a meeting in the Grand Metropolitan's private dining room, ostensibly for a final review of witness testimonies. Each suspect received a carefully worded invitation that suggested their cooperation would help clear them of any suspicion. Colonel Blackwood arrived first, his military bearing intact, but his eyes betraying the strain of the past week. He took a seat near the window, positioning himself with the unconscious tactical awareness of a career soldier. His hands remained steady, but the slight tremor in his voice when greeting the other attendees revealed his inattention. Geoffrey Hamilton appeared next, his theatrical training evident in his attempt to project confidence despite his obvious anxiety. He made elaborate conversation about the hotel's architectural details, seemingly oblivious to the irony of praising the very building where he had committed murder. His notebook, ever present during previous interviews, was notably absent from this meeting. Thomas Fletcher, the young elevator operator, was the most visibly distressed of the group. His supervisor had been required to order his attendance, as Fletcher had become increasingly reluctant to discuss the case. He sat apart from the others, his nervous glances toward the door suggesting he was contemplating flight despite the presence of police officers. The absence of James Morrison, the night watchman, was conspicuous but not unexpected. His flight from London had been discovered the previous day, though police efforts to locate him had thus far proved unsuccessful. His empty chair served as a silent testimony to the conspiracy's growing desperation. Our Belgian detective began his exposition with characteristic precision, outlining the sequence of events that had led to Mrs. Ashford's murder. He described the victim's blackmail activities, the formation of the conspiracy among her multiple targets, and the elaborate planning that had gone into creating an apparently impossible crime. The mechanical modifications to the elevator were explained in detail, with Hamilton's engineering expertise identified as crucial to the plot's execution. The producer's face remained carefully neutral, but his hands betrayed him by unconsciously mimicking the motions he had used to install the hidden control mechanism. Colonel Blackwood's role as coordinator was revealed through the careful analysis of timing and communications. His military experience in organizing complex operations had been essential to ensuring the various elements of the plan came together at the precise moment necessary for success. The colonel's jaw tightened as his leadership role in the conspiracy was exposed. The handkerchief evidence, initially pointing to Blackwood's guilt, was revealed as a deliberate plant designed to mislead the investigation. However, the colonel's own carelessness in handling the evidence had inadvertently provided authentic clues to his involvement. The attempt at misdirection had backfired, adding to rather than diminishing the case against him. Fletcher's unwitting participation was explained with sympathy for his position as an inexperienced young man who had been manipulated by sophisticated criminals. His terror upon discovering the true nature of his involvement had been genuine, though his failure to come forward immediately had made him technically an accessory to murder. The financial records of the conspiracy were detailed, showing how Mrs. Ashford's blackmail victims had pooled their resources to fund the elaborate murder scheme. Bank transfers, cash payments, and various expenses had created a clear paper trail linking the conspirators to the crime's preparation and execution. As our detective's exposition continued, the psychological pressure on the suspects became increasingly evident. Hamilton began showing signs of panic, his theatrical composure crumbling as the evidence mounted against him. His attempts to maintain innocence became increasingly desperate and contradictory. Colonel Blackwood, true to his military training, maintained discipline even as the case against him became overwhelming. However, his protective instincts toward his co-conspirators began to show, particularly regarding Fletcher's minimal role in the plot. His concern for the young operator revealed both his fundamental decency and his acceptance of responsibility for the conspiracy's consequences. The most dramatic moment came when our detective produced the hidden control mechanism that had been removed from the elevator machinery. The device, no larger than a pocket watch, represented hours of careful engineering work, designed to give its operator complete control over the elevator's movement. Hamilton's involuntary intake of breath confirmed his recognition of his own handiwork. This device, our detective explained, was installed with remarkable precision. It required not only mechanical skill but intimate knowledge of the hotel's electrical systems. The killer could start and stop the elevator at will, creating what appeared to be a mechanical failure while actually controlling every aspect of the crime's timing. Inspector Morrison examined the device with professional interest, though its technical complexity was clearly beyond his expertise. The intricate wiring and miniature components spoke to a level of engineering sophistication that few criminals would possess. Hamilton's background made him the obvious creator of this mechanical marvel. Fletcher's confession came suddenly, his composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated evidence and guilt. Through tears, he admitted his role in following the mysterious gentleman's instructions, never suspecting that his cooperation was facilitating murder. His testimony provided the final link, connecting Hamilton's device to its actual deployment. Colonel Blackwood maintained his dignity even as the case against him became irrefutable. When our detective produced letters proving the colonel's coordination role, he simply nodded in acknowledgement. His military honor, twisted though it had become by desperation, would not permit him to deny proven facts or abandon his co-conspirators to face justice alone. The revelation of Mrs. Ashford's extensive blackmail network provided context for the murder's elaborate planning. Our detective read portions of her files, demonstrating how her victims had been systematically exploited and driven to collective action. The scope of her activities had made enemies of some of London's most powerful and resourceful individuals. As the exposition concluded, the three remaining conspirators faced the inevitable consequences of their actions. Hamilton's theatrical career was finished, his reputation destroyed by association with murder. Colonel Blackwood faced not only criminal prosecution but the complete destruction of his military legacy. Fletcher, as the most manipulated participant, might hope for leniency, though his cooperation had been essential to the crime's success. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. The 8th day brought the formal conclusion of the case, as our Belgian detective prepared to deliver his final analysis of the crime to a gathering that included not only the conspirators, but also hotel management, police officials, and several prominent guests who had been present during the murder. The Grand Metropolitan's reputation hung in the balance, and all parties were eager for a resolution that would restore confidence in the establishment's security. Our meticulous detective began his presentation by addressing the apparent impossibility of the crime, explaining how the conspirators had deliberately created a locked-room mystery to confuse the investigation. The mechanical modification of the elevator had been designed not only to facilitate murder, but to make detection seemingly impossible. The genius of this plot, he explained, lay not in its complexity but in its misdirection. By creating an apparently impossible crime, the conspirators hoped to convince investigators that Mrs. Ashford had died from natural causes coinciding with a mechanical failure. Only careful examination revealed the true nature of both the victim's death and the elevator's malfunction. The timeline of the murder was reconstructed with precise detail. Mrs. Ashford had been lured into the elevator by a message claiming that one of her blackmail victims wished to make an immediate payment. The message had been signed with Colonel Blackwood's initials but delivered by Fletcher under Hamilton's instructions. Once Mrs. Ashford entered the elevator, Hamilton had activated his hidden control device from his position in the hotel restaurant. The elevator had been stopped between floors, trapping the victim in what she believed was mechanical failure. However, her captor had been waiting in the shaft, having gained access through maintenance doors during Morrison's convenient absence. The actual murder had been committed by Hamilton himself, though the physical act had been planned and coordinated by Colonel Blackwood. Using his engineering knowledge, Hamilton had created a mechanism allowing him to enter the elevator shaft from the second floor, strangle Mrs. Ashford, and escape back to the restaurant, all within the time frame of his documented dinner. The handkerchief evidence had been planted by Hamilton to implicate Colonel Blackwood, creating a backup plan in case the impossible crime scenario failed to convince investigators. However, the producer's unfamiliarity with criminal investigation had led him to make the evidence too obvious, ultimately drawing attention to the conspiracy rather than concealing it. Fletcher's role had been limited, but crucial. His brother's mechanical expertise had provided technical advice for the elevator modifications, though neither Fletcher brother had fully understood the murderous purpose of their assistance. Thomas Fletcher's manipulation of the elevator controls had been presented to him as a security test, exploiting his loyalty to authority and desire for additional income. The financial arrangements of the conspiracy were detailed for the authorities. Mrs. Ashford's multiple blackmail victims had contributed to a fund managed by Colonel Blackwood, with Hamilton receiving payment for his technical services and Fletcher being compensated for his cooperation. The total cost of the murder plot had exceeded $10,000, demonstrating the victims' desperation to eliminate their tormentor. Dr. Weatherby's medical testimony confirmed that Mrs. Ashford had been strangled with considerable force, requiring strength that Hamilton possessed despite his seemingly delicate theatrical appearance. The lack of defensive wounds indicated that the victim had been taken completely by surprise, consistent with her belief that she was trapped in a simple mechanical failure. The investigation of Mrs. Ashford's blackmail activities had revealed criminal behavior extending far beyond the immediate case. Her files contained evidence of financial irregularities, personal scandals, and professional misconduct involving dozens of prominent individuals. The scope of her activities had created a network of potential suspects that had initially complicated the investigation. However, the coordinated nature of the murder plot had ultimately betrayed the conspirators. Individual blackmail victims might have resorted to violence, but the elaborate technical preparation required collective resources and planning. Only by working together had Mrs. Ashford's victims been able to create such a sophisticated crime. The hotel's security procedures were examined and found wanting in several crucial areas. The ease with which the conspirators had gained access to mechanical areas and manipulated staff schedules revealed systematic weaknesses that required immediate attention. Mr. Pembroke, the hotel manager, acknowledged these failures and outlined comprehensive reforms to prevent similar incidents. Inspector Morrison announced the formal charges against the surviving conspirators. Hamilton faced murder charges as the actual killer, while Colonel Blackwood was charged as an accessory and conspiracy coordinator. Fletcher, given his minimal role in manipulation by the other conspirators, faced lesser charges, but would still face criminal prosecution. The capture of James Morrison, the fled watchman, was announced as police in Dover reported his arrest while attempting to board a ship to France. His flight had provided additional evidence of the conspiracy's guilt, though his capture completed the case against all participants. The civil implications of the case were substantial. Mrs. Ashford's estate faced potential claims from her blackmail victims, while the hotel confronted possible lawsuits from guests who felt their safety had been compromised. The financial consequences of the murder extended far beyond the immediate criminal proceedings. Our Belgian detective's final observation addressed the moral complexity of the case. While Mrs. Ashford's blackmail activities had been reprehensible, murder could never be justified as a response to criminal behavior. The conspirators' elaborate plot had transformed them from victims into criminals, destroying their lives as surely as Mrs. Ashford's blackmail had threatened to do. The case had demonstrated both the power of methodical investigation and the ultimate futility of seemingly perfect crimes. However elaborate the planning, human nature inevitably created opportunities for detection by those with sufficient patience and analytical skill to perceive the truth beneath layers of deception. Chapter 9. Justice and Consequences. The 9th day following the murder brought the first court appearances of the accused conspirators, marking the beginning of what would become one of London's most sensational trials of the decade. Our Belgian detective, though his investigative work was complete, remained involved as a crucial witness whose testimony would be essential to securing convictions. Geoffrey Hamilton faced the most serious charges as the actual perpetrator of Mrs. Ashford's murder. His theatrical background had provided him with skills in deception and role-playing that had initially aided his criminal activities, but these same talents now made his courtroom denials appear artificial and unconvincing. The prosecution's case against him was strengthened by the physical evidence of his mechanical device and the impossible timeline of his restaurant alibi. Colonel Blackwood's military bearing served him better in the dock than it had during the investigation. His acceptance of responsibility for coordinating the conspiracy earned him a measure of judicial respect, though it could not mitigate the seriousness of his crimes. His lawyer argued for consideration based on his distinguished service record and the extreme provocation of Mrs. Ashford's blackmail activities. Thomas Fletcher's case presented the court with a moral dilemma. His youth, inexperience, and obvious manipulation by more sophisticated criminals argued for leniency, yet his cooperation had been essential to the murder's success. The prosecution recommended reduced charges in exchange for his testimony against his co-conspirators, a bargain that reflected both practical necessity and recognition of his limited culpability. James Morrison's capture had provided the final piece of evidence needed to prove the conspiracy's scope. His confession, obtained after his arrest in Dover, detailed the months of planning that had preceded the murder. His testimony revealed the desperate meetings of Mrs. Ashford's victims and their gradual progression from individual resistance to collective action. The blackmail files discovered in Mrs. Ashford's suite created additional legal complications. Many of her victims faced potential criminal charges based on her documented evidence of their misconduct. However, prosecutors recognized that pursuing these cases would transform blackmail victims into criminals, potentially undermining the murder prosecution by creating sympathy for the accused conspirators. The civil implications of the case proved equally complex. Mrs. Ashford's estate, while substantial, faced multiple claims from her blackmail victims seeking recovery of their extorted payments. These civil proceedings threatened to expose publicly the very scandals that the murder had been designed to conceal, creating additional pressure on all parties to reach private settlements. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel faced its own legal challenges. Several guests filed lawsuits claiming inadequate security and emotional distress from their proximity to murder. The hotel's insurance company initiated its own investigation to determine whether coverage applied to losses resulting from criminal activity by guests against other guests. The broader implications of the case extended to London's social establishments. Hotels, clubs, and other venues frequented by the wealthy began reviewing their security procedures and staff screening processes. The ease with which the conspirators had manipulated hotel systems highlighted vulnerabilities that could be exploited by other criminals. Media coverage of the case was extensive and sensational. Newspapers competed to provide the most dramatic accounts of the impossible murder and the blackmail conspiracy. The involvement of military officers, theatrical figures, and society personalities provided rich material for public fascination, though much reporting sacrificed accuracy for entertainment value. Our Belgian detective found himself reluctantly thrust into public attention as the foreign genius who had solved London's most baffling crime. His methods were analysed, praised, and criticised by various commentators, though he remained characteristically modest about his achievements, while ensuring that proper credit was given to Inspector Morrison and the official investigation. The trial proceedings revealed additional details about Mrs. Ashford's blackmail activities. evidence showed that her criminal behavior had extended over several years and had ruined numerous careers and families. While this information provided context for the conspirators' desperation, it could not legally justify their resort to murder. The technical aspects of the elevator modification became a subject of professional interest among engineers and security experts. Hamilton's device was studied as an example of criminal ingenuity, leading to improved security measures for mechanical systems in public buildings. The case demonstrated how technical expertise could be perverted for criminal purposes. The psychological impact of the case on the Grand Metropolitan staff was substantial. Many employees reported feeling unsafe and suspicious of guests, while others worried about their job security given the hotel's damaged reputation. Management implemented counseling services and increased security training to address these concerns. Fletcher's testimony proved crucial in establishing the timeline and coordination of the conspiracy. His detailed account of his manipulation by the other conspirators provided insight into their methods while demonstrating his own limited understanding of their ultimate purpose. His cooperation earned him consideration for reduced sentencing, though he still faced imprisonment. The financial investigation revealed the full extent of Mrs. Ashford's criminal enterprise. Bank records showed regular payments from dozens of victims over several years, totaling hundreds of thousands of pounds. This money had funded a luxurious lifestyle, while providing her with resources to expand her blackmail operations. The case established legal precedents regarding conspiracy charges in complex crimes involving multiple participants with different roles. Hamilton's technical expertise, Blackwood's organizational skills, and Fletcher's positional access had combined to create a criminal capability that none could have achieved individually. As the trial proceedings continued, public opinion remained divided between sympathy for the blackmail victims and condemnation of their murderous response. The case highlighted the destructive power of blackmail while demonstrating the ultimate futility of responding to crime with greater crime. Chapter 10. The Final Accounting. The conclusion of the impossible murder case came on a grey London morning, 3 months after Mrs. Victoria Ashford's body had been discovered in the Grand Metropolitan's elevator. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to witness the final resolution of what had become the most discussed criminal case of the year. Geoffrey Hamilton received the harshest sentence, death by hanging for the murder of Mrs. Ashford. His theatrical training, which had initially aided his criminal activities, failed him entirely in the dock. The jury saw through his performance to the calculating killer beneath, and his fate was sealed by the overwhelming physical evidence linking him to the crime's execution. Colonel Reginald Blackwood, as the conspiracy's mastermind and coordinator, received life imprisonment with hard labour. His military record earned him some consideration, but the court could not overlook his leadership role in orchestrating such an elaborate murder plot. In sentencing, the judge noted that Blackwood's military training had been perverted to criminal purposes, making his crime particularly heinous. Thomas Fletcher's youth and manipulation by more sophisticated criminals earned him the mercy many had hoped for. Sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment, he would have the opportunity to rebuild his life after serving his time. His cooperation with authorities and obvious remorse had convinced the court that he was more victim than criminal in the conspiracy's web. James Morrison, the night watchman whose flight had confirmed his guilt, received 15 years for his role in facilitating the murder. His panic and attempted escape had demonstrated consciousness of guilt that his subsequent cooperation could not entirely mitigate. However, his limited role in the actual planning saved him from the ultimate penalty. The civil proceedings that followed proved almost as complex as the criminal case. Mrs. Ashford's estate faced numerous claims from her blackmail victims, though many preferred private settlements to public exposure of their original scandals. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, ultimately distributing most of her ill-gotten wealth to those from whom it had been extorted. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel survived the scandal, though not without substantial changes. New management implemented comprehensive security reforms, including background checks for all staff, restricted access to mechanical areas, and regular security audits by independent experts. The elevator itself was completely rebuilt, though many guests remained reluctant to use it. Our Belgian detective's role in solving the case enhanced his reputation throughout London's law enforcement community. Inspector Morrison, with characteristic generosity, ensured that our friend received full credit for his brilliant deduction work. The case became a textbook example of how methodical analysis could penetrate even the most sophisticated criminal deceptions. The broader impact of the case extended throughout London society. Many wealthy individuals reviewed their own security arrangements and became more cautious about their private affairs. The ease with which Mrs. Ashford had gathered compromising information served as a warning about the vulnerability of even the most prominent figures. The technical aspects of the case influenced security practices throughout the hospitality industry. Elevator manufacturers implemented additional safeguards to prevent unauthorized modifications, while hotels and office buildings reviewed their mechanical access procedures. Hamilton's device became a cautionary example of how engineering expertise could be misused. The psychological aftermath of the case affected all participants in different ways. Fletcher, despite his lighter sentence, struggled with guilt over his role in the conspiracy. Hamilton showed no remorse for his actions, maintaining his innocence until his execution. Colonel Blackwood accepted responsibility with military dignity, spending his imprisonment writing memoirs that were never published. The case files, preserved in Scotland Yard's archives, continued to provide valuable insights for future investigations. Our Belgian detective's methods were studied and adapted by other detectives, though few possessed his particular combination of analytical brilliance and intuitive understanding of human nature. The media attention surrounding the case gradually faded, replaced by new scandals and sensations. However, the impossible murder remained a landmark case in criminal investigation, demonstrating how the most carefully planned crimes could be unraveled by methodical analysis and attention to seemingly insignificant details. Years later, when our Belgian detective reflected on the case, he often noted how the conspirators' greatest strength, their collective intelligence and resources, had ultimately become their greatest weakness. The complexity required for their elaborate plot had created multiple opportunities for error that a single criminal might have avoided. The moral lessons of the case extended beyond criminal investigation to questions of justice and retribution. Mrs. Ashford's blackmail activities had indeed been reprehensible, but her murder had transformed victims into criminals and solved nothing. The conspirators had destroyed their own lives as surely as their victims' blackmail had threatened to do. The Grand Metropolitan eventually recovered its reputation, though the elevator remained a source of uncomfortable memories for longtime staff. New guests, unaware of the building's dark history, used the elevators without concern, while those who remembered spoke of the murder in hushed tones and preferred the stairs. Our Belgian detective's final observation on the case concerned the nature of justice itself. While the legal system had pronounced its judgment on the conspirators, the true tragedy lay in how criminal behavior had begotten more criminal behavior, destroying multiple lives and families. The case served as a reminder that, in crime, as in war, there are rarely any true winners. The legacy of the impossible murder lived on in the annals of criminal investigation, a testament to the power of methodical analysis to penetrate even the most sophisticated deceptions. For those privileged to witness our Belgian detective's brilliant work, it remained a masterclass in the application of logic, observation, and human understanding to the solution of seemingly unsolvable crimes. And so concludes our tale of murder, mystery, and justice in the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, where an elevator became not transport, but indeed a coffin, and where the impossible proved merely improbable when subjected to the analytical genius of one remarkable detective. This has been Stephen, your host for Cozy Mysteries, bringing you another evening of intrigue and detection. Until next time, remember that, in the world of crime and punishment, the truth will always emerge for those patient enough to seek it and clever enough to recognize it when found.